Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, where we're dedicated to helping you improve your leadership and create a better team culture. My name is JP Nerbun. I'm an executive leadership coach and a culture consultant, and I'm joined by my amazing co-hosts, Nate Sanderson and Betsy Butterick, today to discuss the idea of improving ourselves without losing ourselves. On this journey to being a better leader, to being more effective, there are times where it feels like we aren't just being asked by people or even our environment to change what we do. It feels like we are being asked to change who we are. So Betsy, Nate, and I are going to wrestle with that topic today and then give you a few actionable ways you can go about doing this work for yourself. Now, every episode of the Coaching Culture Podcast, we have extensive notes that are taken, and they're more than just a summary or outline of the discussion, but they also include action items for you. It's a really good way to follow up and make sure that you are implementing something from the episodes that you find valuable. Now, to get these notes, though, you're going to need to be a subscriber to our weekly newsletter, the Team Culture Toolbox. And you could do that by going to tocculture.com. And you'll not just get the notes, but you'll get links to the podcast and our other weekly culture building tools and ideas. Also at tocculture.com, we have a catalog of online courses around playing time, the competitive cauldron, and working with sports parents, as well as our Foundations of Coaching and Sports course and our Transformational Coaching Culture Certification program. All of our courses, they come with a money-back guarantee, and I've never had to refund someone in nearly 7 years because people find these courses to be the most practical resources available for coaches today. Now let's get into my conversation with Betsy and Nate. Well, team, we're back together again for another lively discussion. Today's discussion is going to follow up just on an article that I recently published on some reflections that I had, kind of just finishing up from the college basketball season, where one of the big headlines was the UConn basketball coach, Dan Hurley. And for our international listeners that aren't in the States, Dan Hurley is, probably one of the biggest talked about coaches. He just won 2 national championships. And this year their team UConn struggled as they tried to do the three-peat. And in their last game of the tournament where they lost to Florida, there was an exchange that he had off the court, complaining about referees and things. And it became big media news. And that's kind of been probably the story of the season, is he's probably captured the headlines in the States quite a bit for his behavior, because he would be a yeller, screamer, really, really passionate, really, look him up there. You'll see there's been quite a lot of YouTube videos on his style of coaching, how demanding he is. And one of the things I actually appreciate about Dan Hurley is how self-aware he is in that regard of his behaviors and sometimes that effect on their staff, the players, and how he is very difficult to play for. But anyways, I'm reading an article after the tournament from USA Today, and one of the reporter that written the article, which we'll link in the notes here to the episode, but he posed a really important question, which was, can Dan Hurley change the worst part of himself without losing the best part? And the worst part being this volatile, angry guy that just blows up, which he self-admits is not helping him at times. So can he change that part while still being this really driven, really intelligent coach who is really demanding and pushes teams to be really, really successful? And I think overall, this isn't a conversation today about Dan Hurley. It's not even a conversation around coaches that are angry yellers and screamers, though that was part of my style of coaching for quite some time. This is a conversation today about when there are ways that we operate, or there are parts of ourselves, our personality, our style of coaching, or even the way that we have shaped our values in our coaching context, the way that we've expressed those, when those start to not work for us, when they start to maybe limit us and our effectiveness, how do we work through that? How do we make those changes without sacrificing our values or the best part of ourselves? And so that's the discussion today. So I'll throw this over to you all, Nate and Betsy, which is just, where have you started to see this, or where have you seen this in your work and your own coaching, your own leadership, or in the work with others, show up for other people?
First of all, there's so many things that come up for me in that question, JP, and I love the article that you wrote about it. I thought it was really well written and thought provoking. And one of the things that comes up for me is, especially in the work that I get to do as a coach of coaches, is people often come with a very similar challenge, which is how do I keep this thing that has helped make me successful or that I see as a value add while also doing the work that either I'm being told I need to do by my administrator, by my athletes, or that I genuinely want to do because it's not, things aren't working for me the way they used to, or I don't feel as effective as I once was. So there are a variety of different contexts in a coaching capacity that this shows up in the work that I get to do with others. On a personal note, back in 2011, when I was going through a program called New Ventures West to get my integral coaching certificate, one thing that was pointed out to me that was very challenging at the time was almost the inverse. How does Betsy get rid of one of the best parts of herself in service of doing the work that she wants to do? And it was pointed out to me that part of what had helped make me very successful as a basketball coach was my ability to see the potential in people and help develop that potential to see the best in them. And that would not serve me in the work that I wanted to do with others, because it wasn't about what I saw or what I wanted or, what was dormant inside of them. It was how do I meet them exactly where they are and work in support of what they desire to do. So being told that something that I had always prided myself on and saw as a value add in life, not just in coaching basketball, to be told that that wasn't going to have the same value in the work I aspired to do was incredibly disheartening. Like, how do I kill that part of myself so that I can do the work that I feel called to do? And what I had to realize over time was it wasn't necessary to completely eradicate that part. I simply had to increase my awareness of when that was and wasn't valuable and learn to utilize that strength differently, perhaps even more appropriately or situationally, so that I could keep that and, in the context of doing new and different work, find other skills that were in better alignment with the intended outcome or purpose. So that's a little bit about how it's shown up for me personally and professionally.
I think, JP, when I think about the wording of that question, how do we change the worst part of ourselves while saving the best part? I think in coaching, a lot of times, there might be narratives that have driven us to be successful. One of the things that I have told myself over the years is that I never want to be the reason why our team is not prepared. Or, we never want to walk into a game and face something that we hadn't at least seen on film, maybe put in the scout, or at least the coaches were aware of. And so that's made us really successful. I mean, one of the things that people would describe about our teams is that they always seem to be really prepared and that we were able to, find solutions to problems in the middle of games. But what's the cost of that, right? And does that, mean that I'm watching 3 extra games I don't really need to watch for us to be able to still have a chance to win a game? Does that mean I'm not spending time at home or I'm alienating my family because I'm being driven by this thing that says I don't wanna let the team down or I don't wanna let that be my fault for whatever reason? And so I would look at that and say, and I think this is the trap for coaches, is that that has driven us to be successful, but do we step back and look and say, is there another way to do that? Is there another framing here where that ability to prepare is something that is one of the best parts of me as a coach? I don't want to lose that. And I think there's a fear that says, well, if I'm not driven by that, am I going to be as motivated? Am I going to be as effective in what we're doing? And so sometimes it is letting go of those narratives that have driven us to be successful, to be, to arrive at the place wherever we might be. And it takes courage to step back and reevaluate that a little bit and try to look for, the cost of that when obviously the world says, dude, you're successful. Keep doing what you're doing, man. Like it works. Keep doing what works. And I think we often fall into that more than we are self-aware or take the courage to re-examine some of those paths and narratives.
Yeah, and it's really tough when, like you said, the world is saying that. I mean, I was at traveling to do a speaking engagement, and I was in a bar in Philadelphia airport, and sat next to a few Michigan fans, and they had this rant around Dusty May. he's good, but he's not hard enough on his guys. We need somebody like that Dan Hurley, right? Like he's been successful. He won championships, which I find that it's all interesting and kind of funny because Michigan had just won their conference championship, for the first time in quite some time, But once again, I mean, you see there's narratives and beliefs outside of our context, and then you go within our own personal beliefs. Those are oftentimes not maybe serving us, that are reinforced. I think when I think about the parts of ourself, I don't even like really, I like that question of, that reporter had posed, but I look at just, not to say worst parts, let's just say the parts of ourself. And I think things that I might look at for parts of ourself would be my style as a coach, my coaching behavior. So I look at, JP 10 years ago, I was fiery, passionate, and sometimes that might express itself in me yelling at the referee, stomping my foot, just being angry, right? There's personality tendencies that, I think that's a little bit similar to style, but, there's all these personality assessments that people go through, from strength finders to DISC to equilibria. And I think it's great to have awareness of that, except one of my fears of those personality assessments is people often think of those things as not as changeable as they start to associate that with a deeper level of their identity. People say, well, I am this, like I'm this color, I'm this, whatever the DISC, code is for different people, but like they become part of their identity, and that almost cements it, and they don't see how that can actually change. And your personality is very flexible. And then I think below that is beliefs and assumptions. And I think sometimes that's, you talk about that, Nate, just there, which is, what are the beliefs that are driving my behaviors? Am I aware of those beliefs that, well, I've done this and that's why I've been successful. And if I stop doing this, I won't be successful. That's an assumption. It could be true and it could not be true, right? The coach that never delegates, that does everything themselves because they want it to be perfect. They may have, I can't trust people. Well, maybe there's certain people they can't trust based on their experience, but there's also people they maybe could trust that would do a good job, So there's these beliefs. And then the deepest level is values and identity. But I think so often we look and say our style or our personalities, our beliefs, that's who I am. That's important to me. And that was me 10, 15 years ago as a coach. Is like, I can't stop yelling and screaming. That's who I am as a coach, right? But that's not really who I am, right? Understanding who I am, what's most important to me, my values, I think that is really where we need to start. And I remember Brad Stolberg in his book, Masters of Change, he was on the podcast. He talked about rugged flexibility and having values, and even those values being able to be flexible based upon the context.
Yeah, JP, and you mentioned context, and in communication, context is the biggest barrier, because what is really effective or a best practice for anything in one context may be wholly inappropriate in another. And looking at the language of the question, best and worst, lose and keep, those are opposites. And I think what's true when we talk about awareness is it's less about best and worst and more about what's effective or ineffective. And you can say those are also two opposite ends of the spectrum. So if we reduce that even to how can I be most effective in this context, in this conversation with this person as a coach in my profession? And then when we have lose and keep, it's, how do we evolve? How do we not lose something entirely or keep something wholly? How do we evolve what we have so that we can utilize what's needed to be effective in a situation or circumstance? All of that for me has to do with awareness. And we tend to, I think, culturally or in the context of sport, you talk about values and beliefs. There's certain values and beliefs that we have as coaches, but also you talk about those fans, at the sports bar, that others have of what makes a good coach, what makes an effective coach, what's a bad coach, what's detrimental. And all of it is subjective. Sure, there's best practices, but when I hear a coach say, that's just who I am, the question I often ask is, what if that's just who you've been? Or not even who, but how? What if that's just how you've been? So even the awareness to separate out the stories that we're telling about ourselves, the way we've embodied certain values that we have, and does that have to continue to be the relationship, the narrative that we put forward? Can we increase our awareness, and in doing so, increase the choices available to us so that we can be more flexible. You talk about that rugged flexibility with our way of being, to be very intentionally responsive to specific contexts.
JP, as you're talking a little bit there, and Betsy, about what I think is the difference between a perspective on a fixed trait. I think that's the danger sometimes with our personality inventories, is we take a test and it comes out, oh my gosh, in equilibrium, I'm 88% blue. I'm a feeler, I'm relational, right? And you can walk away from that and think, that's, as you said, that's who I am. And one of the tendencies, or one of the language pieces that we use for that, is that it's more of a tendency than it is a fixed trait. In other words, if you give me a basketball and ask me to bounce it on the ground, I'm going to bounce it with my right hand without thinking. Doesn't mean I can't bounce it with my left hand. Doesn't mean if you put a kid in front of me and tell me to go left, I can't go left. I can work on that thing. But my tendency is always just to bounce it with my right hand, because that's how I started, right? And I think one of the things that we don't recognize, and I don't know if this is the kind of a transition in our conversation here, is that sometimes those strengths can be a detriment in the wrong context. And this is maybe a terrible analogy here, but I was driving our kids into town. We were doing Mother's Day shopping yesterday, the day after Mother's Day, because that's how we do things in the Sanderson household. So we're trying to catch up. And our kids love to go thrift shopping, so we go to the different stores, whatever. So at any rate, we're stopped at this stoplight, and we're going down this road where there's like a half a dozen stoplights in a row, and there's a truck in front of us that's pulling a trailer, big diesel pickup truck, right? And you can tell, like, I don't want to judge truck drivers here or whatever, like guys that drive big trucks, they're great, some of our favorite listeners, but you could tell, like, this guy really took pride in pushing the gas and creating this big cloud of smoke as everybody, as they pull away from the line. And so it was like, red light, we're there, green light, here comes this big cloud of smoke. And then we hit the next red light. And it was funny, like literally, I could see the cars around this truck, like rolling up their windows and sort of like looking around, like, can you believe this guy in all of this traffic blowing smoke? But that was the thing the truck was built for, right? And I think sometimes, like, I think of myself as, I'm built for relationships. And so I lean into that and I hit the gas pedal hard. And there are times where the people around me are like, this feels like exhaust to them. It feels exhausting to them, because it might be too much. It might not be the relationship that they want with their coach. There's lots of reasons why. I have to be a little bit more aware of context. If this guy is taking off in the countryside and he's going as fast as he can and there's a big cloud of black smoke, nobody cares, right? Because nobody's around him. But when I'm leading and I'm thinking about leaning into these gifts, do I have the awareness to look around and see people are putting up their windows, coach, when you walk in and keep asking about their day, or you keep asking about their tests, or you keep leaning into this personal relationship? And if I'm not aware of that, all of a sudden, this thing that I would say is one of my best traits can become a detriment to my ability to be an effective leader.
It's interesting there. You touched on this context, both of you. And I look at something in my coaching journey about, all, 10 years ago. My wife observed how when you changed my context, I changed, my style changed, my personality changed, my happiness changed. When I coached at a varsity high school program, I was this kind of crazy guy, right? I would was quick to rage. And yeah, did I bring that fun and all that stuff in there? Yeah, at times, but I was so quick to move to that style of coaching from a place of anger and frustration. But you put me into coaching the, 7th and 8th grade academy teams and the camps that I would do in the summer. And you were like, these are two different people, right? Like, based upon style. Like, and she said, like, you have so much fun when you're coaching the young kids. Like, like, you're so much more relaxed. And at that time, I'm like, yeah, but that's the way you've got to be. Like, I've got to be this way with these kids and this way with those kids over here, the older kids. And the interesting thing in that is that it showed that I actually had the capacity to change my style, my personality, and I still was myself. I was still bringing my values, right? Really, what ended up being the breakthrough is to Betsy's point, is me going, is this actually an effective way to be with this varsity team? No, it's actually not an effective way to be. It's not working for me. And I probably could bring a little bit of more of that JP into that context. But what is so hard for us as coaches is the narrative that we have around this change. I thought that for me to change was to admit that I was a bad coach. It's like, well, I'm saying like, no, it's just some of the ways that I am coaching, how I'm coaching are ineffective. And to Betsy's point, it's like, how do I want to show up for my team now? Who does my team need me to be in this context? And at the deepest level, yeah, who do I want to be next? Right? Because I want to grow, I want to evolve. I don't want to just change how I coach. I actually wanted to grow more to become that, an embodiment of the things that I value and say are most important. And I think that's a really important distinction that took me a long time to make.
I have one question, JP. What was that voice of like, that's how you got to be? Like, that's one I haven't heard from you before when you're talking about the belief in how to coach different groups. I love that your wife was able to point out that you have that ability, because sometimes the starting point for breaking down that resistance to change is increasing perspective or generating a greater awareness to start to shift that sometimes deeply ingrained belief. I've had coaches say, Betsy, I'm really direct. That's just who I am, right? And when I ask audiences, when it comes to communication, by a show of hands, how many people feel challenged by individuals who are very direct? Easily 50% of every room. And those are typically the people who would not self-describe as direct, right? So, but then if I change the language and say, how many of you appreciate when someone's very clear? That room moves from 50% to 100%. So sometimes just shifting the language, because people who are direct are often very clear, sometimes painfully so. So if we value clarity, how do we work with directness? Either physical proximity, additional words or language, tonality, body language, facial expression, to allow the clarity to come through in a way that is more broadly received, that's more effective. So sometimes the starting point for change is to identify that you're not losing something that you deeply value. You are evolving something to be more effective in a certain condition or circumstance. And even when it comes to coaching kids these days, I hear coaches say, oh, so we need to lower our standards or expectations. You don't have to. And I would argue that doing so might be out of an individual's integrity and doing a disservice to the young people that we're coaching. You don't need to lower your standards or expectations. You need to identify where are they starting from, because the world that they grew up in, the way technology has been present for their life, their whole life, is a different context than previous generations. So by identifying where they're starting from, meeting them where they are, now you can better serve their ability to get to or exceed your standards or expectations. But it starts with awareness. It starts with, and I say this often, I'm not here to change you. I'm here to give you options, so that if you choose to change, you get to make that decision. And I do think there is some magic in offering people that autonomy, which we know is a basic human need. If we or anyone is saying, you need to change, you need to get rid of this worst part of you. Okay, how do we allow them to do that work while still having choice and autonomy in what that looks like on the other side?
So let's get into maybe some ways that we can actually work on this, because I think all of us as coaches, as leaders, as people, we see certain parts of our personality. We see certain parts of our style that may not be working for us. We may even see, at a deeper level, even just certain, maybe we are even aware of some beliefs that we hold about ourselves or the ways that we work that keep getting in the way, that keep coming up for us, and how do we go about making changes here? What might be some ways that people that are hearing this, listening to this and saying, yep, I get this. Okay, but what do I do? Like, what would be some first steps from your perspectives?
JP, you had posted a question in the WhatsApp group for the upcoming retreat here about is there a time where you've recognized a shortcoming, and how have you tried to change with that or something of that nature? And one of the things that I've been reflecting on, just some of my own coaching here, with the help of Chat GPT, my favorite therapist, is that I've realized that when I'm in a leadership position, one of my strengths is that I can read the room pretty well. Like, I become attuned to tone of voice and body language and the way that players are interacting with each other or way they're interacting with me. And that's allowed me to facilitate some really good conversation and, drive us to some good places, right? This hypervigilance, this awareness of just where people are at. But what I've realized here is that when I lean into that too much and become over responsive to a room that isn't tracking with me, or they disagree, or maybe there's some conflict or there's some disagreement, and I start to internalize that. So the strength is I can see it, but the weakness is I don't necessarily always know how to handle it when it goes, from my perspective, sideways into conflict that I'm not comfortable with. That is a detriment to me. That's a place where I need to improve. So there's part of me, going back to your original question, that would look at that and say, well, that's a defection. I'm defective because I'm susceptible to the opinion of others. I'm aware of it. That's a strength, but I'm too susceptible to trying to please others and make everyone happy. That's a weakness. And one of the things in the just like feedback conversation I've had with others is that we can't just discard the ability to read a room because that's really important for a leader. And that's one of the reasons why, in big moments, we've said the right things in a timeout or in a game or at halftime, that have allowed our team to rally. But I also have to have an awareness of the other side of that. And I think I've been lacking that for a lot of my career. And so, again, to answer your question, I think one is a recognition of how has this thing served me, but also coming with that is where have I missed some blind spots where it's become a detriment, and just opening myself up to that perspective clears the way for hopefully for growth and change.
And Nate, to build off of that, because I think you're spot on there as far as looking at, what have I identified as a weakness and how do we not completely discard it? How do we find the inherent value and then work within it to develop it more as a strength or a value add? There's an activity I often do with individuals or groups where I'll invite them to write down a strength that they know they have, something that is consistent, that has routinely added value in personal relationships, in team contexts, whatever the certain circumstance happens to be. And then I ask them to write down an example of when that strength has been put into action for a positive outcome or result. Everyone shares. And then I ask them to take that same strength and identify when is a time where that thing that they know is good, that's a strength, that's a value add, has unintentionally been problematic or caused hurt or harm or been a barrier in some way. Sometimes this is the first time people are looking at one of their strengths in that way, because when we talk about strengths and weaknesses, we often talk about them being different things. And this exercise invites people to take a broader perspective on a strength they know adds value and take a look at where can this be or has it been problematic, so that I have greater awareness to then better manage the way that I utilize this strength. And also, to your point, Nate, where is it a barrier that I'm now aware of? And because of that awareness, I'm perhaps able to navigate differently. And you could start from the opposite end too. We tend to start with strengths. What are your strengths and weaknesses? Rarely do you hear people say, what are your weaknesses and strengths? But then there's that quote that says people only change when they're in pain. When those situations come up, a la the Dan Hurley question, how does he change, the worst part of himself? When things are problematic, we are more likely to take a closer look at what's working and not working. This is an opportunity that's available to anyone at any time to start to do a self-inventory. What do I identify or have others made me aware are certain strengths, certain weaknesses? And then how do I look at the positive and negative in both so that I have greater awareness and information to then be very intentional about the ways that I utilize certain elements in different contexts?
Yeah, I love the suggestions that you guys have given there. And I think, some things that I have written down here that people might consider are kind of an alignment of that. And one of the big things that I actually do a lot with my clients lately is more around, obviously people they're coming to coaching looking for work on themselves, or they have some things that they want to change. So there's already awareness, right? That's something I want to change in my context or in my life or my leadership or my team. And rather than really spend time on personality assessments, which is oftentimes the very popular way to work with, someone in a coaching context, I really want to focus more on values. And what are their values? What's most important to them? And really trying to explore that. And then where does maybe some of the things that their style, their behaviors, their the way that they're operating, how are they maybe feeling a little bit out of alignment with those values, whether it's some of the results they're producing, or the effect that they're having. So just can we be aware of like what's really most important to me, and then where am I failing to be effective in living that out, or bringing that out there. So, and then from to Nate's point, self-compassion, and almost a celebration though of, hey, there are been some ways that these things that are maybe not really effective for you right now have served you well, have helped you get to this level, and maybe are still celebrated by other people. And we can still celebrate them right now, right? So there's a bit of celebration and self-compassion in that. But then I think really for me, the next step is to go, okay, what are the beliefs that I currently hold that are driving this, that are keeping this, to me to operate in this way? Is it the beliefs around my personality, around the style of coaching am I holding that really tightly to my identity? Can we hold that a little bit looser, our style as a coach or a leader? So it's really trying to question the beliefs that are driving that. And let me explain this in a context that would make sense here. I've got a coach that wanted to work really on delegation, right? They're burning themselves out. They're taking everything on themselves. And there are beliefs that this coach she holds that are, she can't trust people, right? She, has great pride in doing it all herself. And that if she does ask people for help, that then she'll be indebted to them. They might think she's lazy. Like these are all like narratives that they have going on there. Now, when we put these beliefs up and we hold them up to the light, this coach was able to go, yeah, well, that one's sometimes true and it's sometimes not true. This one's never really true. I don't even know where that one came out of, or this one, oh, I know where that came from. And they can look back in their history and go, yeah, but that's totally not true, right? So sometimes these beliefs are true, but sometimes they're not true. But it's just pulling them up to the light. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to take action typically. But I always say press pause, because typically when we go to take action, we go into the polarity, which is like, all right, I'm going to now delegate everything. Well, then what happens? People don't let us down. They don't know who this guy is that shows, or this person that shows up and starts giving all these extra tasks and chores, and it doesn't work well for us. So rather than take action, I always advise just spend more time in observation. That's typically the homework for someone. It's the next couple weeks. Notice the behaviors that you do that you maybe want to change, and maybe the beliefs that you have in those moments. Can you pay attention to what you're thinking? What's your thoughts process in there? And sometimes what usually happens is just by asking someone to pay attention, they start to make changes. They start to but it's not a full one, complete 180, change, but they start to go, ooh, yeah, actually, I don't need to do this. And I could ask this person to take on this task. And that's without any prompting. But just paying attention to our behaviors and our beliefs behind that, we naturally start to then question that, and the change starts to flow from that. So that's just one process that I work a lot of my clients through. It's based on the Immunity Change by Keegan and Leahy. And it's been really, really helpful for people to navigate that.
And one thing I would tag on that, JP, that I wish I would have done more with my staff over the last few years is making them aware of the places that I'm trying to be more aware, right? So if it is this idea of hypervigilance, is it asking my assistants, do you recognize me start to freeze up a little bit when there's conflict in the room? Like, in other words, I'm enlisting a couple other sets of eyes here just on the exact thing that you're talking about there, whether it's challenging my assumptions. When I say, look, I think the only way we can win a state championship is if we do X, Y, and Z. Is anybody pushing back on that to explore other possible avenues? Or I hear coaches all the time that I think in some ways become victim of their own success, where they make it to a certain level by demanding all this off-season time, for example, with their teams, and no one ever around them pushes back and says, well, is there another way? Could we be more efficient? Could we do more with less time? That sort of thing. Do we really need to do this, that, or the other? But assistants don't typically do that of their own initiative unless they're enlisted right into that project of trying to improve my coaching and the program as a result of that.
You mentioned that multiple sets of eyes, and I absolutely agree, Nate. That's a best practice for leaders that really want to be effective is let other people know what you're working on. Just that vulnerability as strength, that transparency in terms of building trust and relationship is so key. And yet it's something that we try to hide, or I'm going to work on this, but I don't want to, let anyone know because I'm supposed to already have this skill or capability. Like, no, it's cool. Let other people in, and inviting them in can be really connective for a relationship. As you're talking, JP, and about the awareness and the meaning making, and that's a core question in client work too, is what are you making it mean in any situation or circumstance? The story you just told me, to get at the narrative, to get at the beliefs. And I'm thinking about one thing that was reflected back to me by our therapist. Allie and I are working with a therapist because having a 2 and 4-year-old is really hard, and we want to make sure we stay connected and understanding and growing in our relationship while also prioritizing our children. And Allie has a history of anxiety. This is, well documented in her life experience. And one of the ways it shows up in our parenting is we were at the park the other day and we were down by the lake, and our oldest, who's 4, was near the edge of the water, and I had an eye on her and I was keeping her safe in my mind. But Allie was telling me a couple different things that made it feel for me like she didn't trust me to keep our kid safe. She's telling me things that I already know, that I'm aware of. And when we had a chance to talk later, I said, hey, when you say these things, I feel like you don't trust me to keep our kids safe. And she said, I completely understand how it feels like that to you. For me, it has nothing to do with you. Even though I'm talking to you, I'm saying these things to navigate a situation that is out of my control, which spikes my anxiety. So just by speaking these things, it makes me feel like I have a little bit more control over a situation that's out of my control. It actually has nothing to do with you, and it's not about you, it's about me, which was a huge perspective shift, because how could something somebody is saying to me not be about me? So when we invite other people in, when we have curious conversations about whether it's a way of being or an experience that we've had, we also gain perspective, information that allows us to navigate those spaces differently in the future. So if it's all an awareness game, whether it's the best part of ourselves or the worst part of ourselves, if we can commit to curiosity, awareness, invitation, and then having grace and space within ourselves to evolve and to let that be not just okay, but part of the human process, part of an ideal process, a lot more possibility tends to open up for folks.
Yeah, I just kind of want to bring this back as we're wrapping up here today to this, where we started, which was, we were talking about Dan Hurley, and this is not a podcast about Dan Hurley, but I think that this quote from him really is really insightful into how I used to think as a coach, and I hear other coaches think. And so after the incident of the being knocked out by Florida, he went on the record of saying, hey, I wish I didn't do it. This whole yelling at the referee or complaining about the referees. He said, I'm going to attempt to take measures both internally, mentally, and externally. However, I wouldn't change one aspect of how I coach a game or how hard we fight, but I'd like to get on and off the court without incident. And I'm not going to super analyze what he's saying in there, but it does seem like there's kind of conflicting statements of like, hey, I'm going to take measures to change, but I would never change how I coach the game, right? But I'm pointing this out because I think what's really interesting in this is just so much of what we've talked about today of, hey, how we coach the game. Is that who we are, right? You're seeing that, like how he coaches a game, which is a style, and then the other side of how hard we fight, which is a value, right? And you see them right next to each other and how those have become muddled. And at the end of the day, I would hate to see Dan Hurley stop bringing the fight, the intensity, and the passion that he brings to it, because it has made for some great basketball teams, right? But I would love to see for Dan Hurley and for all the other coaches out there, right, to be able to say, hey, how could I be better? How could I change and grow myself to be better for the people around me, my players, my family, and honestly, for ourselves? Because as Dan Hurley self-admits, this way of coaching and leading, it's burning him out, and it's a real struggle for him. And that's so much the story of so many coaches and leaders in today's world. All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. Don't just subscribe to the Team Culture Toolbox newsletter at tocculture.com. You should also check out Betsy's Substack newsletter. You can subscribe at betsybutterick.com. I read it every week, and I'm always sharing it with other coaches that I know and work with She has so many great insights that she shares with things that you can often go back and do with your teams. So be sure to check that out. By the way, if you found today's episode valuable, the two best ways that you can show your appreciation and support for the podcast is to take time to leave us a great review wherever you listen to podcasts, and also share the episode with some other friends in leadership.